Disclaimer: this episode may include graphic descriptions of crime and criminal activity. It therefore may not be suitable for listeners who are under the age of 18 and people who may find the descriptions as disturbing. Listeners' discretion is advised from this point forward. Hello and welcome to this episode of Crime KE podcast. My good name is Ajuma. I am a journalist from Kenya and your host for this true crime podcast. Now, before we proceed, I was not able to record an episode last week, and for that reason, I will record a bonus episode at the end of this season, which is next week because the last episode of this season goes out next week. So next week, but one, I'll record a bonus episode. Moving on. Today's episode is story number 7 of season 2, and today we are going to unpack the story of a man named John Kibera. Now, if you've been following crime news in Kenya, then you have probably heard the story of John Kibera, Kenya's renowned grave robber. He gained notoriety in the 1990s as one of the most wanted criminals in Kenya. He has been interviewed several times by many media houses in Kenya, and he actually has a funny way of telling the story of his life in crime. So I think we'll just jump right into the story. So without further ado, let us get into today's episode. And please stick around until the end of this episode to find out how you can support this podcast. John Kibera was born in 1981 as the firstborn in a family of 5 children. He said that his mother died when he was 8 years old, so he had to fend for himself at a very young age. Now, at this time, his aunt who lived in Kakamega took him in. He said that from that point, he lived a pretty stable life until when he was 11 years old. That was in 1992. At that time, it was reported that he stole 150 shillings from his aunt to buy food, and his aunt actually sent him to prison for that. Kibera spent the next 6 years in Shikusa Farm Prison in Kakamega, which is a facility for juvenile delinquents. Now, of the 6 years in prison, 4 of them he spent doing a carpentry course. He said that prison was an experience for him because as much as he learned some skills, he also met some hardcore criminals in there. So as much as prison helped, the people he met there sort of inducted him into a life of crime. He got out of Shikusa prison in the mid-1990s when he was 17 years old, and after that he became a regular jailbird, a regular prisoner. He would get arrested from time to time over petty crimes like theft and mugging here and there. And now, by the time he was released from Shikusa, his aunt who had sent him there had died, and her son, who was now the breadwinner of the family, that would be Kibera's cousin. And Kibera came to find out that his cousin was fending for himself by involving himself in crime. His cousin introduced him to the who is who in crime in Kenya at the time, the likes of Kina Rasta, Wanogo, and Washosho, Kina Shimoli, and Cheriot, all of whom I've talked about on the podcast. And this is how Kibera ended up in a criminal gang with Kina Rasta, Wanogo, and Washosho. The gang was known for robbing banks and hijacking motorists in Nairobi, and if you've listened to the previous episode on Rasta, Wanogo, and Washosho in season 1, then you know the activities of the gangs in Nairobi at the time. Now, Kibera said that his role in the gang was mainly just carrying the guns for the gang members as they would rob people. He described his time in the criminal gang as lucky because most of the time when they went out to rob people, some gang members would end up dead. He said that he managed to escape alive every other time, purely out of luck. He was once shot in the ankle during a robbery. Kibera said that his mindset changed when members of the gang were killed, like when Washosho died, when Nogo died, and Rasta died, and even his cousin who introduced him to those people died. All of them died in the hands of the police. He knew that when they all died, like he knew that these criminal activities were not a reliable way of making a living. He knew that if he continued doing the same thing, he would one day end up dead like the rest of them. Now, what completely changed his mindset was the fact that one gang member who had been killed told Kibera that he should take care of his wife and son when he's gone, and Kibera actually agreed. So what he did when he was left alone with this woman and a son to take care of, he convinced this woman to pose as a prostitute to lure motorists so that he could rob them. And they went on with that for a while until sometime in 1999 when police ambushed them in the middle of a robbery and ended up killing her. Now, Kibera managed to escape the ambush alive, and until today, he says that he's still taking care of her son. But this was actually the time when he decided that crime was too risky because now everyone he knew in the world of crime was dead. And at this time, he went to Langata Cemetery to see where his aunt and cousin were buried. And this was when he had some sort of, is it an epiphany? He realized that wealthy people were spending a great deal of money on caskets, which led him to decide to stop robbing the living and instead turn to robbing the dead. He decided that stealing caskets was going to be his new hustle. Kibera sat down and drew a plan of how he would steal caskets and resell them. And the first thing he did was form his own gang to help him do this. He found 8 members, all of whom he met at Shikusa prison, by the way. He told them his plan and they agreed that they would do the robberies together. The next thing he did was try to find a market for the caskets he planned to steal. So what did he do? He went to Parklands and found a coffin shop owned by an Asian man. He talked to the owner and told him about his idea, and he said that he didn't know that he would easily agree to work with him. Now, they decided that they would work together. And how would they do this? Kibera would look at obituary pages in the newspapers. Then he would figure out how much a family is likely to spend on a coffin by looking at things like the size of the photograph in the obituary, the position of the obituary. He said that even the manner in which the obituary described the family could help them tell how rich the family was and if they were likely to spend a lot of money on a casket. Now, once they identified the victim, Kibera and some of the gang members would attend the burial meetings because remember, in the obituaries, they always write the place and time for these meetings before the date of the burial and things like that. Now, he would attend those meetings with some of the family members and even some of the gang members. And while at the meeting, they would try and suggest the coffin shop owned by the Asian man as a good place for the family to purchase a coffin. Then if they would go there and purchase the coffin, Kibera and the gang would make sure to steal it back from the family and bring it back to the Asian seller and get a portion of the money back. Now, sometimes during these meetings, they would even contribute to the coffin expenses and even the clothes of the dead because they knew that if everything goes well, they would get back more than 10 times what they had contributed. So it was sort of, let's say, an investment on their part. Now, that was what Kibera did. The Asian, on his part, would always alert Kibera if a family came to purchase a coffin from his shop. He would tell Kibera to come and check them out if he would do the job. So that is how they conducted their business. Kibera and the gang of 8 went uncaught for a long time while stealing coffins, mainly because people were scared and the gang knew that people were scared and they used that fear to their advantage. They knew that police would never confront a group of men carrying a coffin at night because, come on, we are Africans, like no one wants to get haunted. At first, he said that they were shocked at how easy it was to get away with the crime. There were no police in the graveyard, so there was no one shooting at them. They only had to deal with dead people most of the time. And if a robbery was successful, the case would have no complainant because the victim was already dead. The one time they encountered police was when they tried to raid the grave of Ibrahim Akasha. I don't know if you remember Ibrahim Akasha. I've not talked about him in the podcast, but he's a very famous drug lord and the patriarch of the Akasha crime family. They found that his grave was heavily guarded and they got into an altercation with armed police officers, but they all managed to make it out alive. That is the one time they encountered police during this business that they were doing. So what they would do is they would smoke marijuana as a way to try and make themselves confident enough to handle a dead body. They would then wait for late at night when the family of the deceased was asleep. What am I saying? They would then wait for late at night when the family of the deceased was asleep, and they would go and dig up the grave, take the coffin, and in some cases even some valuables from the deceased. After that, they would throw the body back in the grave, and even in some cases they would just leave the body outside the grave. And I can't even imagine how traumatizing it is for someone who wakes up to find their loved one who was buried the previous day laying there outside the grave. Kibera say that they preferred to rob cemented graves with slabs because it made their work easier, because they didn't have to dig up all the dirt. All they had to do was move the slab, get the coffin, and move it back. He said that during his time robbing graves, he realized that a lot of wealthy people buried their loved ones with a lot of valuables. He said that they stole things like watches, jewelry, shoes, and clothes worth a lot of money from the dead. And they justified the crime by actually telling the dead that the Bible says that you come into the world empty-handed and you will live the same way. So they would say that they are fulfilling the scriptures as they are stealing from them. The delusion is crazy. Now, according to Kibera, he and his gang dug up more than 1,000 coffins, including one that cost 500,000 Kenyan shillings, which they sold back for 100,000 Kenyan shillings. In total, it is estimated that Kibera and his gang made close to 8 million shillings from the theft and reselling of coffins and the valuables that they stole from the dead. Kibera said that he started thinking about quitting this crime when the gang was lynched in Murang'a. Now, let me tell you about what happened in Murang'a. It happened that the 8 gang members had planned to raid a grave in Maragua, Murang'a County, but the locals of the area were already aware of the plan and they laid a trap for the gang. And the gang just fell right into the trap. They were chased down by the locals and they were lynched, and only 4 of them managed to escape alive. Trigger warning for the next sentence. Kibera said that those who were caught were beaten and their bodies were cut using a power saw before they were burnt to death by the locals. After this incident, they stopped stealing for months because they were scared and they had just lost 4 of their gang members. So yeah, the final wake-up call for Kibera to quit crime came in June of 2000. Now what happened at this time was that the 4 remaining gang members went to Lang'ata Cemetery to raid a grave, as they usually did. But the thing is, on this day, the getaway car that was supposed to pick them up delayed to arrive. The car was scheduled to arrive at 5 a.m., but as time went by, they got worried because after 5 a.m., it's 6 a.m., and the sun starts rising at 6 a.m. It would be risky for them to be seen carrying a coffin at that time in the morning. So they decided to abandon the coffin at Lang'ata Road. But as they were walking, they came across a pickup that was delivering Daily Nation newspapers. They decided to carjack the vehicle and use it because their getaway vehicle was not coming soon enough. They carjacked the vehicle, kicked out the driver, and took it back to where they left the coffin. They picked up the coffin and put it back in the back of the newspaper van, and they started driving towards Nairobi CBD. At this time, Kibera's 3 accomplices are sitting at the front of the vehicle, and he's at the back using the newspapers to remove dust from the coffin. The driver who was carjacked immediately went directly to Langata police station and reported that a newspaper vehicle had been hijacked. Now, immediately, police set up roadblocks, and when this newspaper vehicle gets to Kenyatta Avenue, literally in Nairobi CBD, police started firing bullets at the vehicle. Kibera is at the back, and these 3 are seated at the front. Kibera said that he had more than 10 bullets hitting the vehicle, and he knew that his friends at the front had not survived that incident. Now, when the shooting died down, he could hear the cops at the back of the van. He could hear them talking about the dead criminals, and he knew that they were talking about his friends. He could hear them wanting to open the back of the van where he was, and he said that his first instinct was to get into the coffin and play dead. So what he did is he opened the coffin, got inside and closed it, and he lay still pretending to be dead. Now, to make it even more believable that he was dead, he took a piece of cotton from the side of the coffin and put it in his mouth. But at this time, he was already sweating from adrenaline and the fear of getting caught. At this time, he said he could hear the cops wondering what this expensive casket was doing at the back of the vehicle. And they also wondered where these 3 people were taking this casket, that they had to hijack a newspaper van to help them carry the coffin. Now, this particular coffin was actually made with gold, and it cost 2.3 million. One officer told the other to check what was in the coffin, and of course it was Kibera. Kibera said that he could sense the fear in the officer because this is actually what happened. He opened the casket, literally came face to face with a quote-unquote dead Kibera, and he shut the coffin quickly. Kibera said that he had him telling his colleagues that there was a dead body in the coffin and it was covered in sweat. The officers agreed that they would get all the dead bodies to the mortuary, then they would figure out who they were from there. At this time, Kibera said that he knew that he only had one chance to escape, and he took it. He played into the fear of the dead that people have. Now, as the officers removed the casket from the vehicle, before they could put it down, he knocked the casket lid open and jumped out. Of course, no one was going to stand there to figure out if he was dead or alive. He played right into the fear and got away with it. Everyone, including the police, ran away in panic. Now, despite the fact that he got away alive, Kibera said that he knew he could not go on with a life of crime because all his friends were now dead, and he just counted himself lucky to be alive. If he was not quick thinking, he would be dead too. Now, after introspection, in the following hours after that incident, Kibera surrendered himself at Kamukunji police station. He gave up his pistol and confessed to his crimes. He was detained at Kamukunji for 18 days before he was arraigned at Makadara Law Courts. He was charged with the offense of disturbing the dead, and he was imprisoned for 6 months. He served his sentence, and when he got out, he said that he quit crime and gave out all the proceeds of his criminal activities. He gave them out to people, I guess, or charities. He says that he now uses his story to inspire young people to not engage in crime, and he also sometimes works with the police to help them curb crime by talking to young criminals. He is also a pastor who preaches in the streets of Nairobi. Thank you for listening to this episode up until the end. That is all I have for you on the story of Kenya's grave robber, John Kibera. John Kibera has never actually shied away from telling his story. If you search his name, you can find the many interviews that he has done and hear from the horse's mouth. You can support this podcast by sharing it with your friends so that we can reach a larger community of listeners. If you enjoyed this episode, share it on social media and tag us at crime.ke on Instagram. I love interacting with you on social media, so please be sure to tag me or the podcast when you post. You can reach me on my social media at Ajuma on Instagram, X, and TikTok. And I am at Ajuma Millicent on Facebook and LinkedIn. I have provided my social media handles in the show notes of this episode to make it easier for you to find them. So yeah, follow the podcast on Instagram at crime.ke to get updates on the cases I talked about in season 1. And I usually share some things that I find interesting there. So if you aren't following the podcast, then you're probably missing out. If there's a specific story that you want to listen to in this season of the podcast, then you can always DM me or the podcast. And you have only this week to DM me actually before we wrap up this season. So yeah, do so as soon as possible. If you want to share any feedback, you can send in your voice messages through the email that is in the show notes of this episode. I look forward to hearing from you. Rate the podcast on the platform that you're listening in from, and don't forget to catch the next episode of Crime KE podcast on Thursday next week. Same time, same place. But until then, stay safe and remember, it's crime with a K.